let me introduce our last speaker for today. Um, yes, so next up is Professor Sophia Rosenfeld, who's the Walter H. Annenberg Professor of History and Chair of the History Department at the University of Pennsylvania. She will be speaking about revolutions and anniversaries. And thank you so much, Professor Rosenfeld, for joining us. You can share your screen.
Thank you so much. And I'm afraid I do not have a screen to share because I really, what I'm talking about is not at a point where I have slides. It's really at a point where I just want to lay out I think I'll do a little bit what Michelle did and talk a little bit about my work in general, and then about how this small project comes out of that. And so to that end, let me start by saying first a big thank you to everybody who's here listening to this and to everybody who made this visit to the Institute possible. It's a real pleasure to be here, and it's been a delightful first week. So with that, let me start by saying that I would describe myself as a rather odd kind of historian, maybe even an odd kind of intellectual historian, because what I study is primarily what you might call the taken for granted, or the obvious, or the commonplace, the kinds of ideas and sentiments that we don't talk about very much and we don't reflect on very much because they seem so ordinary as to be almost natural, simply the way the world is. Bourdieu called them famously doxic ideas. And what interests me as a historian is where such ideas come from, how they possibly ever either change over time or fall out of fashion, how they get practiced, and what they do to shape and structure people's lives, especially political lives in the age of democracy. Because I take the kinds of ideas that most people don't pay much attention to, these kinds of ideas we don't fight over, to be the truly foundational ones, the ones that undergird all the other ideas that we're explicitly debating and fighting over in any time and place, the kinds of ideas that actually anchor our institutions and our laws. People who talk about these things in the history of science often use the term historical epistemology, but they're generally interested in what's specific to the sciences. I'm interested in what might be called the historical epistemology of our social and political lives, especially in the modern era, so sort of 18th century onwards. So to give you some idea of what I'm talking about, I've tried to do this over a series of four quite different books. My first was on the era of the French Revolution and about France, and focused on thinking about language and gesture, and especially new forms of sign language for the deaf and the ballet d'action and other cultural practices. And why? Specifically to explore the idea of how the quest for a perfect sign system that would produce a world of perfect communication prevented the French revolutionaries from accepting disagreement or discord or any kind of party politics as a key or necessary element of the practice of self-rule. So that was the first. I really thought about sort of how thinking about language shaped thinking about politics. The next project that I worked on was really on the whole idea of common sense itself, how the idea of a shared and ordinary realm of ideas that came into being on both sides of the Atlantic in the 18th century both helped produce the American and French revolutions, but also proved to be a problem for democracies once established, how common sense turned into a right-wing and largely exclusive idea once democracies were up and running. I think that has some relevance to this moment. And you can see a little bit how these have evolved in relation to our own political moment. And the third was written during the first Trump years, was a shorter book on democratic notions of truth and the tensions between a kind of populist common sense notion and an expert version, and how these two different strands developed between the 17th century and the present, and the dangers now for either of them alone without the sustenance of the other. We might be seeing a moment right now, for instance, of a real kind of turn against expertise in many parts of the world that really challenges this traditional balance. And finally, most recently, this year, very recently, was published my most recent book on choice and how it came to be so closely associated with freedom in political and cultural, in commercial culture alike. And I wanted to know what social practices brought about this synergy, this one we still live with, and what the consequences are for how we live today of imagining freedom largely as a matter of choosing off menus of options in keeping with personal predilections or preferences. So if that gives you some idea of the kinds of things that I'm interested in, you might be thinking, what am I going to do in 1 month at the Institute? Well, some of my time here is going to be given over still to a little bit more work on choice. I've just written a response to an interview questions for a kind of grand entretien and le vif. I'm doing some other kind of public things like that. I just finished an essay for The Guardian on Trump and choice, and I'm getting a kind of new set of questions about common sense, actually, ever since Trump insisted that he was, in the spirit of Tom Paine, instituting revolution in common sense, but we might say in reverse. But mainly, I want to work on a very specific project that I'm a small piece that I'm writing for an event at the Library of Congress in the fall in Washington. That's really about the intellectual genealogy of this way of approaching political history, including the history of revolutions. So as many of you know, 2026 is around the corner. And in the US, that is being marked as the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution. And needless to say, Americans are having trouble figuring out how to mark this occasion for very obvious reasons. So I'm interested in a question of historiography and method at this point. First, I'm interested in coming up with some sort of sense of the evolution of the understanding of the relationship between ideas and political revolutions. And second, I'm interested in whether this kind of history of historiography or history of method can help us come up with a topology for thinking about the assumptions and attitudes that democracy requires today. So maybe it goes without saying that I'm certainly not the first person to try to write this kind of history. I see my work as belonging in a long tradition of what might be called the intellectual or cultural history of collectivities. And this kind of thinking about mentalité or histories of collective thinking has been woven in and out of political analysis in different moments in different ways. In the 18th century, philosophical historians from Voltaire to the Scots were interested in how shifts in thinking, like the emphasis on reason, might bring about shifts in social and political and economic organization. You can think of Diderot proposing in the Encyclopédie that a revolution in men's minds would be a precursor to the rationalization of other aspects of life. Or conversely, you could think of Hannah Arendt in the mid-20th century, writing about totalitarianism and its differences and similarities from democracy, and trying to figure out what different habits of mind, from ways of lying to forms of judgment, are created by different political systems. But for the purposes of this talk and what I want to do this month, I want to look at the 1920s and a less known book, neither Diderot nor Hannah Arendt, which in 1926, so the 150th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, or just a little more than 100 years ago, was published by Princeton University Press with the title, The American Revolution Considered as a Social Movement. The book written by Franklin Jameson, who was one of the first really academic historians in the United States, is mainly associated with sort of professionalization of the field more than anything else. And why is Jameson worth reviving? For most US historians, he's simply a name, or he's a hypothesis in a nutshell that the American Revolution was socially as well as politically transformative. The idea that it began as a political revolution, but it had in the end profound and real social consequences, and not just for its architects, but for the population of North America as a whole. And for forwarding this argument, Jameson's known to historians as one of the inaugurators of the progressive school of historical interpretation. Two things, though, interest me about Jameson beyond this well-known thesis. The first is that writing in the 1920s, which at the moment I don't see as coincidental at all, Jameson's one of the first people to see the American Revolution as a revolution. That is, not as an exceptional independence movement in an exceptional place, but as one of a series of revolutions. And though he doesn't quite draw the comparisons, it's clear that he has in mind the English, the French, and ultimately the Russian Revolution. Writing in a moment in which he's responding to a pattern of change. And I think that's important. The second thing that I want to draw attention to is the final chapter in his book, one called Thought and Feeling, which is generally taken to be less important than the rest of the book. But I think it too comes close to saying something new. He points out how hard it is to ever discover the key ideas of what he calls the less articulate classes, by which I think he means really those who left fewer traces, especially the non-literate. But he argues that there's enough evidence, especially if one looks at religious practices, to conclude that if political changes were accompanied by social and economic ones at the time of the American Revolution, social and economic ones were also accompanied by a change in thinking about and performing social relations. He uses terms we might not use. He calls this public opinion and popular emotion. But he's really obviously thinking about something like what his contemporaries in France were just beginning to call the history of mentalité. And I think it's also interesting that he's almost the exact contemporary here of Marc Bloch, writing about the King's Touch in 1924, and just a little bit later, Georges Lefebvre's famous History of Political Emotions, The Great Fear, about the beginning of the French Revolution. And I don't think, I'd have to look closer, I don't think they really are necessarily know about each other, but I see a kind of synergy in the post-war moment, post-World War I, post-Russian Revolution. Jameson himself talks a lot about sort of post-war psychology, an interest in a moment like ours in how thought and emotion are driving and also being created by political change. So what does Jameson have to say these major shifts are? A little catalog here. He surveys religious life, by which he really means post 1776 Christian life in the original colonies, the first states. And he shows most obviously a growing sense of toleration of multiplicity. He stresses not just separation of church and state, but disestablishment, the process by which no state kept or held on to the idea of one official religion or church and accepted of ultimately multiple denominations within Christianity. But he also looks at a few things that are slightly more unusual and interesting. One is, he says, this is an era in which churches spend a lot of energy writing up their own rules, writing up their own constitutions. And he also stresses that it's these different denominations that spend a lot of energy building new educational institutions, including many of the universities most well-known in the United States today. And he stresses a growing sense of some kind of equality, natural equality even, among humans. Even as he says religious fervor kind of goes up and down, he shows pockets of accelerating religiosity and pockets of growing secularism and disinterest. So historians might ask, does he get this right? You know, you might focus, for instance, on the fact that he actually doesn't ask anything about women or about the enslaved or about the truly propertyless. And you might ask, does he even get religious life right? But those aren't what really interest me here. I'm interested more in why Jameson wants to call attention to these particular values in this particular moment. Because though he's focusing on religion, it seems to me he puts his finger on the constellation of assumptions or attitudes, we might call them, that are in crisis in our moment 100 years later, and that in many ways are threatening to undo democracy itself. In a way, we all reverse engineer our stories of the revolution to fit the times in which we're writing. And there's something prescient about Jameson's focus on these developments, even though we put them in different terms. But I'd say, and I'd like to make a case for this really, and this is what I hope to develop this month, that along with democracy requiring certain kinds of institutions, policies, and laws, there are also some sort of broad-based intellectual commitments and emotional commitments that need to be quite widely shared for them to work. And there are four things I'd point to, and in many ways they really dovetail with Jameson's discussion of the invention of these modes. So one is a commitment to some kind of pluralism, especially ideologically, an acceptance of the idea of some forms of difference. But the other three are about sharing. Some commitment to playing by shared rules. Jameson's very interested in the writing of rules. I'm interested in the fact of the undoing of rules in recent years, even around accepting the results of elections. Another one is some commitment to the shared pursuit of truth and knowledge, seeking a kind of consensus about what's really true. And Jameson stresses the growth of educational institutions in this moment, a moment when we're seeing the undoing of conceptions of truth and of the institutions and practices used to achieve them. And finally, I think we need some sense of solidarity with others for democracy to work. The sense that other people's fates, even people we don't know, people we don't like, matter to us. I think empathy is too strong a word. It's hard to be empathetic about every person in the world, but some basic notion that humans have some concern for each other, something that again seems to be under attack at this moment, but which Jameson saw as actually growing in the post-revolutionary era. So what do we do with this? The last time both the US and France celebrated major turning points in the history of revolutions, 1976 and 1989, the world was in a very different place. There was much talk, some of you will remember François Ferré saying, the revolution's over. And there was a strong sense of celebration that liberal democracy had largely prevailed. A progress narrative was dominant. Now, historians of race, and just maybe a lesser degree, historians of women have complicated that story in recent years. What did revolutions mean for indigenous people and the enslaved in the US? What did the revolution in France mean for the people of Haiti, for example, have been pressing historical questions. But now we find ourselves not just questioning what did the revolution not do for people who've been marginalized, but we're asking kind of, is democracy about to fail? And we're asking it in the United States, but we're asking it in many parts of the world with large democracies, India, Brazil, parts of maybe the European Union in part. And so my question is, what kind of history can we and should we write now on the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence? I'd like to write one that focuses on laws and institutions and policies, yes, but also about these shared commitments and thinking about the historiography of the Age of Revolutions, I hope will give me a chance to also consider where ideas emerge, where they start to decline, and even what we might be able to do to keep them alive. I'll stop right there.
Thank you. Great. Any questions? Yes, Sally.
Well, thank you so much. It's a fascinating and extremely timely question, and I would say unfortunately, but we're here to address the real thing. So as you because you just arrived, you don't know yet how we do this. The classic seminar here. The idea is, well, you know, I'm not in your discipline, but I know how this problem has been tackled in mine, and perhaps you could have a look. So I'll play that game. And so there's there is a science of common sense, and it's called social representations theory, right? There's about 2,000 scientists working on this. And so it's basically the school started by Serge Moscovici, And one aspect, because there are several branches, but the structural approach of social representations is probably the one by Abric, might be especially interesting to you because they describe social representation, common sense about a concept. For example, if you Google social representations of democracy, you'll find a series of papers with empirical surveys on what people think about democracy. And so the structural approach says that there's a central core, that's the piece of the thought that most of the population shares, and there's these peripheral stuff. And interestingly, for your approach, the central core components usually are connected to important values in the given society. And so it might be interesting to have a look at this theoretical instrument. The other one is that there is, a guy named Ignace Meyerson, who was at École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and who's been working in the cultural evolution of concepts. And I think is very close to, especially the beginning of his book that I think was called Les fonctions psychologiques et les œuvres. It might be interesting to have a look at this and how, a given concept changes meaning across time based on the local culture. I think it would be nice to connect this with these theoretical approaches. The social rep is very lively, but Meyerson has been a bit forgotten. And yeah, that was just my suggestions. Yeah.
Thank you. That's terrific. I'm making notes as you spoke there. I'm very interested in thinking about how different disciplines approach this problem. I'm even interested in the work of computer scientists who have the greatest trouble in terms of AI with teaching how common sense is one of the hardest realms to replicate in various ways. More complex kinds of thinking are in a sense easier. And so I'm interested in all of the places in which common sense has become an object of study precisely because it sounds like the thing that should transcend study, and particularly a kind of study that sees it as evolving, culturally formed. It's supposed to be the category that isn't cultural and isn't historical. And of course, we find that it almost always is. So I'm also always interested in the work of psychologists in particular, because psychologists, too, their work reflects in many ways the psychological questions of their own moment. And they offer often really terrific clues for how to think about differences between individuals, but also group behavior of different kinds. So my work on choice, for instance, is very steeped in work in behavioral economics, precisely for the kinds of questions that you're talking about. So thank you.
Great, thank you. I see something else on the chat. Would you, Minka, like to say the question, or should I read it?
Sure. So I was just reflecting that, yes, I use the term shared humanity in terms of what you were referring to. And I think we need to hold multiple truths, right? Sometimes which are often opposing. And I don't know if you've ever looked at a country's various dimensions. So, one of the ones is around individualism. And the US and Canada, where I am, are high on that characteristic. So those are some of that influences the stories, right? And I hope that your version will have some of the stories as told by the individuals who have been the most stigmatized and continue to be in the Western world. So more commentary than a specific question, but sounds like some amazing work.
Well, thank you very much. This is a prospective rather than retrospective, so I hope it will turn into something interesting. Yes, often I think not only is it important to bring out the voices of people at the margins, but often it's the dilemmas of people at the margins who help illuminate the problems of the whole. in interesting ways. So for instance, in my work on choice, a lot of it focuses on women, not only because women were the first kind of modern choosers in many ways, but because that kind of choosing that they did, this preference-based choosing, was itself stigmatized and made both choice and women problematic for their associations with each other for a very long time until kind of commercial choice becomes more widespread. So I take that suggestion very, very favorably. And I'm again interested in the case of what sustains a democracy in that very tension between how to keep a certain amount of difference alive and actually positive feelings about difference, but also how to come up with enough shared values or qualities that a society isn't just pulled apart at the seams. And I worry that we have very few shared arenas at present. And does not mean to erase difference, but a very low level sense of some basic truths, some basic sense of solidarity, some basic commitment to rules are kind of essential, I think, for any kind of institutions or laws to be built upon them.
Great. And I see that next.
For me, it's a little bit more difficult because I'm not from a far field. I mean, I'm working basically on I'm an historian, and I'm an historian of the French Revolution, and I'm sort of working on something quite similar, which is like how a marginal movement can can give light on the formation, on the cultural formation of the French Revolution, and on the other side, how the French Revolution changed this movement and its ideas. So I mean, we are a little bit in the same boat. So it's much more difficult to find a simple question. But anyway, I think my question is somehow methodological, which is my impression is that you have a very wide general problem, which is the problem probably. So, for example, well, how cultural change, how there was some cultural and not juridical basement in democracy that fell apart, and we didn't realize that it was happening, and it happened. And so when did it happen? Should we return back to the 18th century? Should we see what was not working already at that time? Should we see on a more recent past? I mean, it's really huge, and at the same time, you have a more specific subject that is your historian and the first century. I have not understood very well how the general problem and the historiographical question works together. So how the second is a pathway to manage this huge problem that you are facing.
It's a very astute question, because that's exactly what I'm trying to work out right now, is precisely that. And I hope we can talk further, because I'm aware that we are overlapping in our interests, especially kind of 18e, etc., and with an interest in these questions. I'm interested in the fact that every era writes the story of the coming of democracy differently to suit different kinds of needs. And I'm using that as a gateway to ask, what kind of history of democracy do we need now? And how should that be different from what was written in 1976 or 1989, or even on the 200th anniversary of the Haitian Revolution, all of which suggested democracy was a work in progress, but it was improving over time. And that maybe we'd left out various people, we'd left people at the margins, but as we brought them in, we were, in a sense, strengthening democracy, coming closer to some kind of achievement of the ideals of the Declaration of the Rights of Man or the Declaration of Independence, the notions of equity, liberty, fairness and justice. I think it's very hard to make that case right now. And yet we have an anniversary upon us. And I'm trying to sort of look at different formulations of the problem of the relationship between ideas and political change and see if there's something in this that can help us make sense of both the anniversary and our own moment. How those pieces are exactly going to fit together, I have my work cut out for me to do because I haven't really figured it out. But I see the possibility here not of simply exploring another dimension of common sense, but of asking more broadly, what kind of common sense do we need today? And how can we find it?
If I can add something,
Yeah.
common sense has also a very deep history in philosophy. So that's another path that maybe could be an etymological trajectory that sometimes is useful to illuminate the sense of the stories.
So in my work, I try to go in between all the time, philosophy on the one hand, and kind of social practices on the other. So I'm interested always in the connection between
Yeah.
ideas and sort of lived experience. So the book that I have, which is on common sense, for instance, it's in French as well as in English, is designed to sort of make the case for how common sense comes to be lived as a set of practices, but also how it emerges in the thinking of people like Thomas Reid and Tom Paine and theorists of the counter-revolution in France, all the way up to Kant and Arendt in the 20th century. So that's exactly what I'm interested in.
Other questions or comments?
I appreciate these questions. They make me want to have more conversations over lunch in the next coming weeks.
Yeah, very good. Yeah.
If I may, though, so the US is made of currently of a myriad of people from various origins in terms of country. And so I guess the part of, for me, the complexity is that those thought leaders, philosophers that you are referring to are from primarily the Western world. And so I guess what about philosophies from other parts of the world that now the peoples of those places now make up the US citizenship, if that makes sense? So I
It
think that's
does.
part of the complexity. And, as I put in the chat, there's so much conversation now. So, women and men, forgetting that there's more than two genders in the current state. And then, of course, from an intersectionality perspective, the women decisions of those who are racially minoritized, disabled, etc., those were very different, or the capabilities to make decisions were very different over history and remain to this day. So I think that those are some of the nuances in your context that make it even more complex.
That's fair enough, and I can't claim an expertise in the sort of thought of the world. I wish I had capacities and languages that I don't. But I hope that in all of my work I can set up questions and paradigms that other people can take up with greater knowledge than me in other contexts. So, for instance, the work on choice is primarily a kind of European American story, North American story, although it deals with, it starts out with everything from Indian cotton to auctions of enslaved people in the Caribbean. That said, I'm interested in how those ideas have been globalized. I'm also interested in how they've been resisted in different places. And I'm interested in the hybrid forms that they take when they are picked up in different places. I can't do all of that work myself. I can kind of point to places and examples, But if the book on choice, for instance, is successful at all, what I hope it will get people to do is to show how very differently, for instance, freedom is constructed in contemporary China, where certain notions of choice have certainly become important in thinking about commercial culture, but operate very differently politically. And it's exactly that kind of variety that I think is important to stress. So I'm not looking for one model for the world, but I am looking for certain kinds of commonalities, very, very low-lying commonalities that I think provide foundations for the kinds of differences in thinking that emerge in lots of different cultures. And I take your point exactly about the multicultural quality of most large democracies today, South Asian, North American. We all share certain things by virtue of belonging to particular political cultures, and we have differences as well that coming from different subgroups within those cultures, economically, racially, regionally, religiously, all the various age-wise. And I think, any good historical work looks always for both commonalities and differences across space and time.
And if I can add one more reference on this,
Please.
Has been working precisely on these differences according to the position that you have in society regarding one specific concept of common sense, like democracy or, freedom, or you name it. Because of course it depends where you are, and you don't have the same vision, yeah, as you just said.
Tell me who were you referring to? I missed the name.
I just put it in the chat.
Terrific. Thank you.
Yes.
Oh, okay, great.
Left
Thank
us
you very much.
not very long ago, unfortunately, but
but that's great to know.
Yeah.
Thank you.
From Geneva.
Yeah. Right. No, this is very helpful. Thank you.
All right. And anything else? We have 3 minutes. All right. If not, yes. So thank you so much, Professor Rosenfeld, for your presentation, and everyone for the questions.